The year was 2387, and humanity had carved its place among the stars through sheer determination and a refusal to quit when things got hard. The Montana's pride cut through the black void of space like a silver dart, its hull scarred from years of hauling cargo across dangerous sectors where most ships refused to go. Captain Jake Morrison sat in the command chair with his boots propped up on the console, watching the stars streak by as his ship maintained its course toward the frontier colonies. Jake was not your typical cargo captain. He had served 10 years in the human defense fleet before retiring to the merchant life, trading his military uniform for the freedom of independent hauling. His crew called him Cowboy, a nickname earned during his service for his habit of ignoring standard tactics and making up his own rules when lives were on the line. He wore the name with pride, though he would never admit it out loud. The ship carried medical supplies bound for colonies on the outer rim, nothing glamorous but honest work that paid the bills and kept the Montana's pride flying. Pete Collins worked in the engine room, a middle-aged engineer who could fix anything with duct tape and creative cursing. Amy Chen handled navigation from her station on the bridge, her fingers dancing across holographic displays as she plotted their course. Through disputed space where 3 alien empires claimed ownership but none enforced it. The distress signal came through at 0314 hours, crackling with interference and desperation. Amy's console lit up red, and an automated voice announced an emergency broadcast on all frequencies. Jake dropped his feet from the console and leaned forward, his relaxed posture vanishing in an instant. Pete emerged from the engine room, wiping grease from his hands as the bridge speakers crackled to life. The voice was human and female, tight with controlled panic. Commander Lisa Harper identified herself as the senior officer at Research Outpost Frontier 7, a xenobiology station studying alien plant life on a barren moon 3 hours from their current position. Her words came fast and clipped. Krellian raiders had breached the facility 20 minutes ago and seized control of all major systems. 23 human scientists and technicians were being held in the main cafeteria under armed guard. The raiders were stripping the facility of anything valuable and had announced their intention to sell the prisoners to slave markets in the outer reaches. Lisa's voice dropped to a whisper as she continued transmitting from a hidden location within the station. She had maybe 8 hours before dawn on the planet's rotation cycle, which was when the Krellian commander had declared all prisoners would be executed if no ransom arrived. The raiders would take what they wanted and leave no witnesses. She gave her coordinates, and then her transmission cut to static, presumably discovered or forced to go silent. Jake stared at the empty air where the holographic display had shown Lisa's distress marker. The bridge fell silent except for the hum of the ship's systems and the soft beep of Amy's console. Pete spoke first, his voice careful. The proper procedure was clear in situations like this. They should relay the distress call to the nearest human defense fleet base and continue on their route. Military response teams existed for exactly this type of crisis. Getting involved was not their job. Amy pulled up the tactical display and ran calculations without being asked. The nearest military base was 14 hours away at maximum speed. Even if the fleet scrambled a response team immediately, they would arrive 6 hours too late. She looked at Jake with understanding in her eyes. They both knew what those numbers meant. By the time proper help arrived, Lisa Harper and 22 other humans would be dead or worse. Jake pulled up the distress signal recording and played it again, listening to the fear buried beneath Lisa's professional tone. He had been in her position once, stranded behind enemy lines during the outer rim conflicts with hostile forces closing in, and rescue uncertain. He remembered the crushing weight of hopelessness as hours ticked by and help did not come. A transport captain named Rodriguez had violated direct orders to pull Jake and his squad out, risking his ship and crew to save 7 soldiers the fleet had written off as acceptable losses. Jake owed his life to a man who decided rules mattered less than people. Pete argued against getting involved. The Montana's pride was a cargo hauler, not a warship. They had minimal weapons, a small crew, and no tactical advantage against Krellian raiders who were professional soldiers. The math was brutal and simple. 3 civilians in a merchant vessel against 20 armed hostiles, and 3 military-grade assault ships. They would die trying to be heroes, and Lisa Harper would still be executed at dawn along with everyone else. Sometimes the smart choice was accepting you could not save everyone. Jake understood Pete's logic. Everything the engineer said was true and reasonable and based on cold, hard reality. They were outgunned, outmanned, and operating far outside their capabilities. Any sane person would relay the distress call and move on with a clear conscience, knowing they had done what protocol demanded. But Jake had never been accused of being sane, not during his military service and certainly not now. He remembered Rodriguez's face when the transport had landed in a hot zone to extract Jake's squad. The captain had simply said that sometimes you ignore the odds and do what's right, because leaving people to die was not an option he could live with. Jake made his decision. They were going in. Amy protested immediately, pulling up probability calculations that showed a 12% chance of survival if they attempted a rescue. Pete threw his hands up and asked what possible plan could work against those odds. Jake stood from his command chair and moved to the navigation console, his jaw set with determination. He told them the truth without sugarcoating it. They probably would not survive this. The smart money was on them dying in the next few hours trying to save people they had never met. But he had listened to Lisa's voice and heard the same desperation he had felt years ago waiting for rescue that might never come. He asked his crew for a vote because he would not order them to die with him. This was volunteer only. Pete looked at Amy and Amy looked at Pete, and some unspoken communication passed between them. The engineer sighed and said if they were going to do something this stupid, they better get started because 8 hours would vanish fast. Amy's fingers flew across her console as she plotted a new course that would cut through an asteroid field and shave 90 minutes off their approach time. Jake felt something tight in his chest relax. He had the best crew in the galaxy. The Montanas. Pride changed course and accelerated toward Frontier 7. Jake moved to the communications station and began reviewing everything they knew about Krellian tactics and psychology. Pete headed back to the engine room to start preparations for what Jake was planning. Amy focused on navigation, guiding them through dense asteroid fields where one miscalculation would smear them across a rock. The clock started counting down. 7 hours and 40 minutes until dawn. 7 hours and 40 minutes until Lisa Harper ran out of time. Jake pulled up the distress signal one more time and studied the audio pattern. He could hear equipment in the background and the echo of the room she transmitted from. Small details that might matter later. He made a promise to the recording. "Hold on, we're coming. Just hold on until we get there." The Montana's Pride raced through the darkness toward an impossible rescue that every regulation said they should avoid. But Jake Morrison had never been good at following regulations when lives hung in the balance. The Cowboy was riding to the rescue one more time, and heaven help anyone who stood in his way. The Montana's Pride shuddered as it navigated through the asteroid field. Rocks the size of buildings drifting past close enough to scrape paint if Amy's calculations were off by even a meter. Jake stood behind her station watching the navigation display with absolute confidence in his pilot's abilities. She had flown combat missions during the war and knew how to thread a needle at full speed. The ship groaned and Pete's voice crackled over the intercom, asking if they could maybe slow down before the hull developed new stress fractures. Jake ignored him and kept his eyes on the countdown timer. 6 hours and 20 minutes until dawn. He had been thinking about the problem since they changed course. A frontal assault was suicide and they all knew it. The Krellians were reptilian warriors who stood 7 feet tall with natural armor plating and enough strength to break human bones like twigs. Their technology was roughly equal to human military standards, which meant the raiders would have energy weapons, shields, and combat experience that made Jake's crew look like children playing soldier. The 3 assault ships orbiting Frontier 7 could vaporize the Montana's Pride before they got within weapons range. Standard military doctrine taught that you never engaged an enemy without superiority. In at least one major category, the raiders had superior numbers, weapons, position, and capability. Jake's ship had exactly one advantage that he could identify. The Krellians thought like soldiers, following tactical doctrine and logical strategic planning. Humans, especially humans like Jake Morrison, had built their reputation in the galaxy by refusing to think logically when it mattered most. Alien species called it reckless. Jake called it creative problem-solving. He moved to his private cabin and pulled up everything intelligence services had compiled on Krellian psychology and culture. The reptilian species valued strength and direct confrontation. They respected boldness but viewed clever tactics as cowardly. A warrior who won through deception was considered less honorable than one who lost in direct combat. This cultural bias made them predictable in certain situations. They would not expect a lone cargo hauler to attempt a rescue because the action would be suicidal and therefore illogical. The Krellians would assume any approaching ship was either unaware of their presence or seeking to negotiate. Jake began forming a plan that relied entirely on the raiders underestimating human stubbornness. It was insane and had maybe a dozen points where everything could go catastrophically wrong. Pete would hate it. Amy would probably call him several unflattering names in 3 languages. But it was the only approach Jake could see that gave them any chance at all. He started making notes and running scenarios, looking for the fatal flaws that would get them killed. Pete appeared in the doorway an hour later with coffee and a concerned expression. The engineer had worked with Jake long enough to recognize when the captain was planning something that violated common sense. He sat down without being invited and asked what horrible idea was forming in that reckless brain. Jake laid out the basics. They would not fight the Krellians directly because that was unwinnable. Instead, they would bluff, manipulate, and create chaos until the raiders had no choice but to retreat. Pete listened in growing disbelief, and when Jake finished, the engineer pointed out at least 15 ways the plan would fail. Jake acknowledged every criticism because Pete was right about all of them. The plan required perfect timing, incredible luck, and the Krellian commander making several specific decisions under pressure. If any single element failed, they would die. Pete asked the obvious question, why do this at all? They did not know Lisa Harper or any of the people trapped on that station. No one would blame them for leaving this to military response teams. They could relay the distress call and return to their normal lives with clear consciences. Jake had thought about that question during the flight. He could have given Pete a dozen noble reasons about duty and honor, and not abandoning fellow humans in crisis. All of those things were true. But the real answer was simpler and more personal. During the war, Jake had led a squad behind enemy lines on a reconnaissance mission that went bad. They were cut off, outnumbered, and waiting for evacuation that kept getting delayed. Command had finally written them off as acceptable losses and moved on to other priorities. Jake had accepted he would die on that worthless rock along with his soldiers. Then Rodriguez had appeared in a transport ship, burning through atmosphere at angles that should have torn the craft apart. The captain had violated direct orders, risked court-martial, and put his crew in danger to extract 7 soldiers everyone else had abandoned. Jake had asked him why during the flight out. Rodriguez had looked at him with tired eyes and said he had children back home. He wanted them growing up in a galaxy where people helped each other instead of calculating acceptable losses. Sometimes you had to be stupid and heroic because the alternative was becoming the kind of person who could ignore a distress call. Pete understood without Jake having to explain further. The engineer had his own reasons for flying with a crew that took jobs others avoided. He stood up and said he would start preparing the ship for Jake's insane plan. If they were going to die trying to be heroes, they might as well do it properly. He paused at the door and mentioned that Amy had already started modifying their approach vector without being told. She knew Jake well enough to predict his decisions. They were a crew of stubborn humans who apparently could not help themselves from doing the right thing, even when it was stupid. Jake returned to the bridge as they cleared the asteroid field. Amy reported they had cut their travel time by 95 minutes, but the ship had taken minor damage to the port stabilizer. Nothing critical, but Pete would need to patch it eventually. The countdown showed 5 hours and 12 minutes until dawn. Jake sat in his command chair and began rehearsing what he would say to the Krellian commander. Everything depended on selling his role as a greedy, foolish merchant captain who had stumbled into a dangerous situation. The next 3 hours passed in tense preparation. Pete rerouted power systems and rigged several creative modifications to the reactor that made him nervous just thinking about. Amy hacked into old files from Frontier 7's public databases to pull building schematics and layout plans. Jake studied Krellian military protocols and communication patterns. They were preparing for the most important performance of their lives because one mistake would end with all of them dead or enslaved. As Frontier 7 appeared on their long-range sensors, Jake felt the familiar calm that always came before action. Fear and doubt vanished, replaced by cold focus on the mission. He had led soldiers into impossible situations before and survived through combination of skill, luck, and sheer determination not to die. This was bigger than any combat mission from his military days. 23 civilians were counting on rescue they did not know was coming. Lisa Harper was hiding somewhere in that station waiting for dawn and execution. Jake opened a channel to his crew. He told them they could still turn back. No shame in recognizing when the odds were too long. Pete responded first with a crude suggestion about what Jake could do with his offer. Amy added that they had come this far, and she wanted to see if Jake's ridiculous plan actually worked. They were committed. All or nothing. Save everyone or die trying. The Montana's Pride approached Frontier 7 with running lights active and broadcasting standard merchant identification codes. Jake could see the 3 Krellian assault ships in orbit, their weapons active and scanning patterns suggesting high alert. The outpost itself sat on the barren moon's surface, a cluster of white domes connected by pressurized corridors. Somewhere inside, Lisa Harper was counting down her final hours. Jake keyed the transmitter and began broadcasting on all frequencies. He identified himself as an independent salvager, responding to what he claimed was an automated distress beacon from an abandoned facility. His voice carried just the right mix of greed and ignorance. A stupid human merchant who had stumbled into a situation he did not understand. The Krellians would find it amusing. They might even let him get close enough to dock before killing him. That was all Jake needed. Just get close enough to dock and then the real plan could begin. The response came 60 seconds later. A deep voice speaking accented but clear English. The Krellian commander identified himself as Thex and informed Jake that the facility was under new management. There was dark amusement in his tone. He asked what cargo the Montana's Pride carried. Jake answered truthfully. Medical supplies bound for the outer colonies. Nothing military or dangerous. Just basic equipment and pharmaceuticals. Valuable enough to be worth taking but not threatening enough to warrant immediate destruction. Thex allowed them to approach. Jake could hear the smile in the commander's voice. The Krellian was confident and amused by this foolish human who had delivered himself and his cargo into their hands. Perfect. Let them think he was an idiot. Let them believe they had all the power and control. Jake had learned during the war that your enemy's confidence was a weapon you could use against them. The Montana's Pride moved slowly toward the station, flying into certain danger with nothing but a desperate plan and the stubborn refusal to let innocent people die without trying everything possible to save them. The Montana's Pride drifted toward Frontier 7 with deliberate slowness, playing the role of a nervous merchant captain approaching an uncertain situation. Jake kept his hands steady on the controls while his heart hammered against his ribs. The 3 Krellian assault ships held position in orbit, their weapon systems tracking his vessel with casual menace. Any aggressive move would result in instant vaporization. He could feel sweat running down his back despite the climate-controlled bridge. Amy sat at her station working, frantically, to hack into the outpost's external sensor network without alerting the Krellians to her intrusion. Her fingers flew across holographic keyboards, routing her signal through a dozen proxy servers and exploiting security backdoors that should not exist. The researchers at Frontier 7 had been scientists, not military personnel. Their network security was adequate for keeping out casual hackers, but not designed to stop a former military intelligence officer who knew every trick in the book. Pete remained in the engine room making final preparations. Jake could hear him muttering to himself over the intercom, running through checklists and double-checking systems that would need to work perfectly when the moment came. There would be no second chances and no room for mechanical failure. The engineer was essentially turning their cargo hauler into a bomb while keeping it functional enough to fly. It was the kind of technical challenge that would be fascinating if their lives did not depend on the outcome. Thex's voice crackled over the communication channel again. The Krellian commander wanted to know why Jake was approaching so slowly. Was there a problem with his ship's engines? The question carried an edge of suspicion beneath the mocking tone. Jake forced himself to sound nervous and uncertain. He explained that his sensors were picking up unusual readings and he was being cautious. Better safe than sorry when approaching an unfamiliar situation. He asked if there was any danger he should know about. The Krellian laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. Thex assured Jake there was no danger at all as long as he cooperated. The facility had changed ownership through standard salvage rights. If Jake wanted to conduct business, he was welcome to dock and discuss terms. Otherwise, he should leave immediately. The implication was clear. Comply or be destroyed. No middle ground. Jake confirmed he understood and adjusted his approach vector toward the main docking port. Amy's console chimed softly. She had penetrated the facility's network and was downloading internal schematics and sensor data. Her screen showed a detailed layout of the entire outpost complex. 3 main dome structures connected by pressurized corridors. The central dome housed administration, life support, and the cafeteria where the prisoners were being held. The West Dome contained research laboratories in Lisa Harper's last known location. The East Dome held living quarters and storage. Krellian raiders were spread throughout all 3 sections. The tactical display showed 20 hostile signatures, exactly as Lisa had reported in her distress call. 12 of them were clustered in the central dome guarding the prisoners. 5 patrolled the corridors between sections. 3 remained on the Krellian assault ships in orbit. The raiders' deployment suggested they were preparing to strip the facility methodically rather than rushing. They felt safe and in control. That confidence was exactly what Jake was counting on. Amy highlighted Lisa's location on the map. The commander had found a hidden maintenance closet in the research lab and was still transmitting periodic status updates on a heavily encrypted channel. She was alive and unharmed, but reported that the Krellians had announced the dawn deadline to all prisoners. 4 hours and 18 minutes remaining. The raiders had made it clear they would execute everyone and destroy the bodies if ransom did not arrive. No witnesses, no evidence, no consequences. Jake studied the facility layout and started mentally walking through his plan. He needed to get inside and stall for time while maneuvering Thex into a position where the Krellian commander had to choose between pride and survival. Every step required perfect timing. Too aggressive, and the raiders would kill the hostages immediately. Too passive, and Thex would see through the deception. Jake had to thread a needle while juggling chainsaws and hoping nothing went wrong. The Montana's Pride reached the docking port, and Jake initiated the connection sequence. Mechanical clamps locked onto his ship's hull with metallic thuds that echoed through the frame. Pete reported all systems ready. Amy confirmed she had full access to the facility's internal network and could monitor everything happening inside. Jake stood from his command chair and grabbed a sample case filled with medical supplies. Time to put on the performance of his life. He gave his crew final instructions. Pete would remain in the engine room and initiate the reactor sequence on Jake's signal. Amy would stay on the bridge monitoring everything and feeding Jake information through his hidden earpiece. If things went bad, they were to seal the ship and run. No heroic last stands. Get out and report what happened so someone could try again. Neither of them acknowledged the order because they all knew it was meaningless. They were in this together until the end. Jake cycled through the airlock into Frontier 7. The outpost's atmosphere was breathable but stale with the metallic taste of recycled air that had been running too long without maintenance. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows down the corridor. He could hear voices deeper in the facility speaking in the guttural Krellian language. Heavy footsteps approached, and Jake arranged his face into an expression of nervous greed. 3 Krellian warriors rounded the corner. They were massive up close, towering over Jake's 6-foot frame. Their scales were a mottled gray-green, and their eyes were cold yellow slits that tracked him with predatory focus. They carried energy rifles that could punch holes through starship hulls. Jake raised his hand slowly, showing the sample case and making no aggressive moves. One warrior patted him down roughly, finding and removing the small sidearm Jake carried. The Krellian examined the weapon with contempt and tossed it aside. The warriors escorted Jake through the facility toward the central dome. He walked slowly, looking around with apparent curiosity while actually mapping the corridors and identifying potential choke points. Amy's voice whispered in his earpiece, feeding him updates on raider positions. 2 guards outside the cafeteria where the prisoners were held. 5 more in the command center. Thex was waiting in the main administration office. They entered a large room that had once been the facility director's office. Thex sat behind a desk that looked comically small beneath his bulk. The Krellian commander was older than the warriors who had escorted Jake, his scales darker and marked with scars that spoke of long experience. Intelligence gleamed in his yellow eyes. This was not some mindless brute. Thex was a veteran who had survived decades of combat by being smart and ruthless. Jake set the sample case on the desk and launched into his rehearsed pitch. He was an independent trader carrying medical supplies to the colonies. When he received the distress signal, he saw a business opportunity. The facility obviously needed new management, and that management might be interested in acquiring valuable cargo. He could offer a substantial discount in exchange for safe passage through this sector, and information about other opportunities. His tone was carefully calibrated to sound greedy but not suicidal. Thex listened without interruption. When Jake finished, the Krellian picked up one of the medical devices from the sample case and examined it. He asked Jake if he understood the situation here. Did this foolish human realize he had just flown into the middle of a military operation? Jake swallowed and nodded. He claimed he was not interested in politics or laws. He was just a businessman trying to make a living in difficult times. Surely they could reach an arrangement that benefited everyone. The Krellian commander smiled, showing rows of serrated teeth. He appreciated Jake's boldness, even if it was incredibly stupid. Very well, they would negotiate. But first, Jake would need to prove his cargo was worth the trouble. Thex ordered his warriors to escort the human on a tour of the facility, so he could see what he was dealing with, an inspection before finalizing any deal. Jake agreed readily, hiding his satisfaction. This was exactly what he needed. They walked through the outpost with Jake asking endless questions and examining every room with exaggerated interest. He haggled over prices, questioned the value of various items, and generally behaved like a greedy merchant more focused on profit than danger. The performance bought him time to observe guard rotations, identify weapon storage, and note which corridors had functional doors. Amy's voice provided constant updates in his earpiece. Lisa was still hidden and undetected. The other prisoners remained in the cafeteria, frightened but alive. They passed a window that looked into the cafeteria, and Jake caught a glimpse of the hostages. 23 humans sitting on the floor under heavy guard. Most were young scientists with the soft look of people who had never experienced real violence. A few older researchers sat with defiant expressions. They knew they were going to die but refused to show weakness. Jake felt cold rage building in his chest but kept his expression neutral. An hour passed with Jake stalling, negotiating, and asking pointless questions. Jake sprinted through corridors that had become a maze of sealed blast doors and flashing warning lights. The countdown in his earpiece showed 41 seconds until the reactor reached critical mass. His boots hammered against metal flooring as he searched for any route to the cafeteria, where 23 prisoners waited to die. Every door he tried was locked solid, sealed by Thex's final commands. The Krellian had been thorough. No obvious escape routes remained accessible. Amy's voice guided him through the facility. She had pulled up the maintenance tunnel system that Lisa was using. The tunnels ran beneath the main corridors, designed for repairs to environmental systems and power conduits. They connected all 3 domes, but the access points were hidden behind panels that most people never noticed. Amy directed Jake toward the nearest entrance, 30 meters ahead and around 2 corners. The countdown showed 34 seconds. He found the panel exactly where Amy indicated and yanked it open. A narrow shaft dropped into darkness with a ladder bolted to the wall. Jake did not hesitate. He grabbed the ladder and slid down, using his hands on the rails to control his descent rather than bothering with the rungs. The shaft was barely wide enough for his shoulders. Pipes and cables lined the walls, carrying life support and power throughout the facility. The countdown showed 27 seconds. Jake hit the bottom of the shaft and found himself in a tunnel that stretched in both directions. The space was cramped and dark except for emergency lighting strips along the floor. Amy told him to go left and run like his life depended on it, which was accurate because it did. Jake ran in a crouch, his head scraping the low ceiling. The tunnel twisted and branched. Amy called out directions. Left at the junction, straight through the next section, right at the water main. The countdown showed 19 seconds. He emerged into a wider chamber where multiple tunnels converged. Lisa Harper stood there with a panel open and her hands working frantically on exposed circuitry. She looked up as Jake appeared, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. The commander was younger than Jake expected, maybe 30 years old, with dark hair pulled back and brown eyes that burned with desperate determination. Her uniform was torn and bloodied, but her hands were steady as she worked. Jake asked what she was doing. Lisa did not stop working as she answered. The lockdown had sealed the blast doors throughout the facility, but it was running through the main security system. She could override it from here if she could reroute control through the maintenance network. It would take maybe 30 seconds to implement. Jake looked at his countdown. 14 seconds. He told her they did not have 30 seconds. Lisa's jaw tightened. Then they would have to try anyway because she was not going to die without fighting until the last possible moment. Jake crouched beside her and asked what she needed. Lisa pointed to a bundle of cables on the opposite wall. She needed him to disconnect the red and blue cables, cross them, and reconnect. That would create a bypass, allowing her to access the security system. Jake moved to the cables and started working. His hands shook from adrenaline, but years of military training kicked in. Stay calm. Focus on the task. Ignore the countdown. Ignore the fear. Just do the job. 10 seconds, he disconnected the cables. They were thicker than expected, and the connectors were tight. Precious time slipped away as he worked them loose. Lisa's fingers flew across her jury-rigged interface panel. She was talking to herself, running through code sequences aloud. 8 seconds. Jake crossed the cables and started reconnecting them. The first connector slid home. 6 seconds. The second connector stuck. Jake cursed and twisted it. 5 seconds. The connector clicked into place. Lisa's panel lit up with green indicators. She had access. Her hands moved in a blur across holographic controls. Jake watched the countdown. 4 seconds, 3. Lisa entered a final command and slapped the execute button. Every blast door in Frontier 7 began opening simultaneously. The lockdown was broken. 2 seconds. Jake grabbed Lisa's arm and pulled her toward the nearest tunnel. 1 second. Pete's voice filled Jake's earpiece. The engineer had been monitoring the reactor countdown from the Montana's Pride. He announced in a tight voice that they were out of time. The reactor had reached critical mass. Then nothing happened. No explosion. No detonation. Jake and Lisa stopped running and looked at each other in confusion. Pete started laughing, the sound slightly hysterical. He explained what Jake had not told anyone except Amy. The reactor overload was real, but the detonation was not. Pete had rigged the reactor to build toward critical mass exactly as threatened. Every reading the Krellians could scan showed genuine overload conditions. But at the final moment, the engineer had built in a vent system that would redirect the explosion into a shaped charge aimed away from the station. The blast would destroy one of the abandoned Krellian boarding craft still attached to the facility. It would look and sound like a catastrophic explosion, but Frontier 7 would survive mostly intact. The Montana's Pride would be heavily damaged but repairable. No one had to die. The shaped explosion tore through the facility like a shockwave. Jake felt the floor buck beneath him and grabbed Lisa to keep them both from falling. Alarms shrieked. Dust rained from the ceiling. The lights flickered and died. Then emergency systems kicked in. When the shaking stopped, Jake helped Lisa to her feet. His ears were ringing, but he was alive. They were both alive. Pete reported the Montana's Pride had held together despite the damage. Amy confirmed all 3 Krellian assault ships had boosted to safe distance and were now fleeing the system. Believing they barely escaped total destruction, Jake and Lisa climbed back up to the main facility level. The blast doors were open. Confused prisoners were emerging from the cafeteria, freed by Lisa's override. They looked around in shock, trying to understand what happened. One moment they had been waiting to die. Now they were standing in damaged but functional corridors with no raiders in sight. A young scientist approached Lisa and asked if they were rescued. Lisa looked at Jake. He realized she still had no idea who he was or why he had appeared in her facility. Jake introduced himself properly for the first time. Captain Jake Morrison of the Montana's Pride. He had received her distress call and decided to try something stupid. Lisa started laughing, the sound carrying an edge of hysteria. She asked if he meant he had flown into a Krellian raiding operation with a cargo hauler and somehow convinced them to evacuate. Jake shrugged. When he explained it like that, it did sound pretty stupid, but it worked and everyone was alive, so he was calling it a win. The other prisoners gathered around as word spread. The raiders were gone. Some crazy cargo captain had bluffed an entire Krellian team into retreat. Rescue was standing right in front of them, covered in dust and grinning like an idiot. People started crying, hugging each other, laughing with relief. They had been hours from execution, and now they were free. Jake felt the weight of the last 6 hours catching up to him. His legs went weak, and he sat down hard on the floor. Lisa sat beside him. She asked how he knew the rescue would work. Jake admitted he did not know. The plan had maybe a dozen points where everything could have failed catastrophically. If Thex had been less proud or more paranoid, if Pete's calculations had been wrong, if Lisa had not been able to override the lockdown, they would all be dead. Sometimes you had to bet everything on a desperate gamble, because the alternative was giving up. Lisa looked at him with something like wonder. She said humans were crazy, Jake agreed. That was why other species found them so unpredictable. Amy's voice came through the earpiece asking if Jake was alive. He confirmed he was fine and asked for a status report. Amy said the Montana's Pride was in rough shape, but Pete thought he could get them flight-worthy with repairs. The Krellians were gone. Station sensors showed no hostile contacts within range. The facility had damage to several systems, but life support was stable. They would need proper rescue and recovery teams, but everyone would survive until help arrived. Jake stood up and offered Lisa his hand. They had work to do. The prisoners needed medical attention and the facility needed to be secured. Then they could contact the fleet and arrange proper evacuation. Dawn had arrived on schedule. The Krellian deadline had passed. Everyone who should have died was instead standing in a damaged facility counting their impossible luck. Lisa took his hand and let him pull her up. She told him she owed him a drink when they got back to civilization. Jake said she could buy him a whole bottle. He had earned it. Pete emerged from the Montana's Pride looking tired and covered in engine grease. He surveyed the damage and whistled. That had been the stupidest thing he had ever participated in, and he had once tried to outrun a solar flare. Jake punched his shoulder lightly. He had full confidence Pete would get their ship flying again. The engineer grumbled about impossible expectations, but Jake could see satisfaction in his eyes. They had done it. Against all odds and common sense, they had pulled off a rescue that would be talked about for years. Amy joined them on the facility's main deck. She hugged Jake hard enough to crack ribs. She had been watching everything from the ship and was certain they were all going to die. Now they were standing in triumph. The hours following the rescue were a blur of organized chaos as Jake and his crew worked. Alongside the freed prisoners to stabilize Frontier 7, the facility had taken significant damage from Pete's shaped explosion, and the structural integrity was questionable in several sections. Lisa coordinated teams to seal breaches and reroute power to critical systems, while Jake helped Amy establish communication with the nearest human naval base. The response came faster than expected. Admiral Kyle Norton himself answered the distress relay. Jake delivered his report with professional clarity despite his exhaustion. Frontier 7 had been seized by Krellian raiders. 23 human civilians had been held hostage with execution scheduled for dawn. His crew had responded to the distress call and successfully forced raider evacuation through tactical deception. All hostages were alive and safe. The facility was damaged but stable. They required immediate medical support and long-term recovery operations. Admiral Norton listened in silence, and when Jake finished, there was a long pause before the Admiral asked if Captain Morrison was the same Jake Morrison who served in the defense fleet. During the Outer Rim conflicts, Jake confirmed his identity and waited for the reprimand he knew was coming. Norton asked how many regulations Jake had violated attempting this rescue. Jake started counting in his head and gave up after reaching 15. Probably too many to list in one conversation. The Admiral made a sound that might have been a laugh. He told Jake that a proper response team was being scrambled and would arrive within 8 hours. Until then, Morrison was in command of the facility and responsible for keeping everyone alive. Also, there would definitely be a formal inquiry when this was over. Jake acknowledged and cut the channel. Lisa approached as Jake finished his report. She had organized the prisoners into work teams and established a medical triage in the least damaged section of the central dome. 4 people had minor injuries from the explosion, but nothing life-threatening. The rest were shaken and exhausted but physically unharmed. She wanted to personally thank Jake and his crew for what they had done. Her voice was steady, but Jake could see the emotion she was holding back. These were her people, her responsibility. She had been facing the reality of watching them die and being powerless to prevent it. Jake told her she did not owe him anything. He had simply done what anyone should do when receiving a distress call. Lisa shook her head. Most people would have relayed the call and continued on their route. That was the logical, safe, proper response. Jake had flown into a combat situation with a cargo hauler and no backup. He had bet his life and his crew on a plan that should not have worked. She asked what made him different from all the other captains who would have passed by. The question hit deeper than Jake expected. He thought about Rodriguez pulling his squad out when command had written them off. He thought about all the close calls during the war when someone made the choice to try, rather than accept acceptable losses. He told Lisa that during his service he learned the difference between following orders and doing what was right. Sometimes those aligned, sometimes they did not. When they conflicted, you had to choose who you wanted to be. He wanted to be the kind of person who answered distress calls even when it was stupid. Pete interrupted their conversation with news that made everyone nervous. His damage assessment of the Montana's Pride was worse than initial estimates. The shaped explosion had compromised the main reactor housing and cracked 2 of the primary support beams. The ship could maintain life support and communications, but attempting faster-than-light travel would likely result in structural failure. They were stuck at Frontier 7 until proper repair facilities could be arranged. Jake absorbed this information and asked how long Pete needed to make the ship safe for in-system travel at sublight speeds. The engineer estimated 12 hours. Amy reported more concerning developments. Her analysis of the Krellian withdrawal showed the raiders had fled toward the border territories where human law enforcement had limited jurisdiction. Thex and his crew would likely regroup and continue operations elsewhere. The destruction of their boarding craft and the humiliation of being forced to retreat would make them more dangerous. Raiders who felt they had been made to look foolish tended to take that personally. Jake asked if Amy thought the Krellians would return for revenge. She said it was possible but unlikely in the immediate future. Thex would need to rebuild his reputation before attempting another major operation. The rescued scientists began sharing their stories as shock wore off and reality settled in. They had been conducting routine research when the Krellian ships appeared without warning. The raiders breached the facility in under 10 minutes. Resistance was impossible. The scientists were researchers, not soldiers. They had been herded into the cafeteria and told they had 8 hours to wait for ransom that everyone knew would not arrive in time. Some had written final messages to families. Others had simply sat in numb silence waiting for the end. One young biologist named Chris approached Jake with tears in his eyes. He had a wife and infant daughter waiting for him back on Earth. He had accepted he would never see them again. Now he was going home because a stranger decided to be heroic. Chris asked how he could possibly repay that gift. Jake felt uncomfortable with the gratitude. He suggested Chris just go home and hug his family. Live a good life. That was payment enough. The biologist promised he would and walked away to compose a message to his wife. Lisa pulled Jake aside as the day wore on. She wanted to show him something. They walked to the research wing where her laboratory was located. The room was a disaster of overturned equipment and scattered data crystals. The Krellians had ransacked everything looking for valuables. Lisa explained that her team had been studying extremophile organisms that thrived in the moon's harsh environment. The research had applications for terraforming and medical treatments. 3 years of work had been compiled into comprehensive reports that the raiders destroyed searching for anything they could sell. But Lisa had been clever. She had backed up critical research data to a hidden server in the maintenance tunnels where she had been hiding. The information was intact. Every experiment, every discovery, every breakthrough survived. She could rebuild the research and complete her work. Jake understood the significance. He had not just saved lives. He had preserved knowledge that would help future colonists survive harsh worlds. The rescue had accomplished more than anyone realized. Pete found them in the laboratory and announced the Montana's Pride was ready for sublight travel. He had patched the worst damage and reinforced the compromised sections. The ship would not win any beauty contest, but it would fly. Jake asked about faster-than-light capability. Pete shook his head. Not until they reached a proper shipyard. Jake accepted this and started planning their next moves. They would remain at Frontier 7 until the fleet arrived. Then his crew would need to arrange repairs and face whatever formal inquiry Norton had mentioned. Amy called Jake back to the communications station. She had intercepted a transmission on Krellian military frequencies. Thex was broadcasting an announcement to other raider groups. He described the incident at Frontier 7 as a tactical retreat in the face of overwhelming force. The Krellian commander was lying to preserve his reputation, claiming he had been ambushed by a human warship rather than admit a cargo hauler had forced his evacuation. Jake listened to the transmission and smiled. Thex's pride would not let him tell the truth. That worked in Jake's favor. Let the raiders believe humans had superior forces in this sector. The scientists organized a meal using supplies from the facility's stores. It was simple food but felt like a celebration. People who had been hours from death were eating together and sharing stories. Laughter filled the cafeteria where prisoners had waited in terror. Jake sat with his crew and watched the scene. Pete was already half asleep, exhausted from his repairs. Amy was talking with several scientists about navigation and stellar cartography. Lisa moved through the room, checking on everyone and offering quiet encouragement. A researcher named Danny stood and called for everyone's attention. He wanted to make a toast to Captain Morrison and his crew. 3 people had flown into impossible danger to save 23 strangers. That was the kind of courage that defined what humanity should be. Everyone in this room owed their lives to a cargo captain who decided regulations mattered less than people. Glasses were raised. The toast was drunk. Jake felt his face heating with embarrassment. He muttered that anyone would have done the same. Lisa caught his eye and shook her head. Not anyone. Most people would have made the safe choice. Jake had made the right one. The celebration was interrupted by Amy announcing an incoming transmission from Admiral Norton. The fleet was 6 hours out. Norton wanted to speak with Jake privately. They moved to a quiet office and Jake accepted the channel. The Admiral's face appeared on the screen. He looked older than Jake remembered from their brief encounters during the war. Norton asked for complete honesty. Had Morrison really forced a Krellian raider team to retreat using nothing but a cargo hauler and creative deception? Jake confirmed every detail. Norton listened, and when the story concluded, the Admiral leaned back in his chair. The defense fleet arrived exactly 6 hours after Admiral Norton's transmission. 3 destroyers and a medical frigate dropped out of faster-than-light travel within visual range of Frontier 7. Jake watched from the observation deck as the warships took up protective positions around the damaged facility. The sight of human military vessels brought visible relief to the rescued scientists. They were truly safe now. The cavalry had arrived and nothing would threaten them again. Norton came aboard the station with a full security detail and medical team. The Admiral was shorter than Jake expected, barely reaching 5.5 feet, but he carried himself with the authority of someone who had commanded fleets in combat. His uniform was crisp despite the long journey, and his eyes were sharp as he surveyed the facility damage. He found Jake in the command center reviewing repair schedules with Pete and Amy. Norton dismissed everyone else and closed the door for a private conversation. The Admiral started by thanking Jake for his service to humanity. What Morrison had accomplished here would be studied at military academies as an example of creative tactical thinking under impossible constraints. Norton had already received preliminary reports from the rescued scientists. Every single person credited their survival to Jake's intervention. That kind of unanimous praise was rare. It meant Morrison had done something genuinely extraordinary. Jake accepted the compliment awkwardly and said he was just in the right place at the right time with the right crew. Norton asked detailed questions about the rescue operation. He wanted to understand every decision, every contingency, every moment when the plan could have failed. Jake walked through the entire sequence from receiving the distress call to Lisa, overriding the lockdown in the final seconds. The Admiral listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a data pad. When Jake finished, Norton sat in silence for several moments. Then he said the defense fleet had a problem that maybe Jake could help solve. The problem was simple. Raiders like Thex operated throughout the border territories where human authority was limited. They seized facilities, kidnapped civilians, and generally made life dangerous for colonists trying to build new worlds. The fleet responded when they could, but military assets were spread thin. Response times were measured in hours or days. By the time warships arrived, hostages were usually dead and raiders had vanished. What the fleet needed was someone who could operate in gray areas where regulations did not apply, someone who thought creatively and took risks that military commanders could not justify. Jake understood where this was going before Norton finished. The Admiral was offering him a job, not a formal commission, but a civilian consultant position with broad authority to respond to crisis situations using whatever methods worked. The fleet would provide intelligence support and backup, but Jake would have operational freedom. He would essentially be doing what he just did, but with official blessing and better resources. Norton made it clear this was an offer, not an order. Jake could decline and return to cargo hauling with no hard feelings. Pete and Amy were called back into the room to hear the same offer. Norton wanted the entire crew. He believed their combination of skills and willingness to operate outside normal parameters made them ideal for the role he envisioned. Pete asked about compensation. Norton smiled and said it would be significantly better than hauling cargo. Amy asked about authority and jurisdiction. Norton explained they would have civilian contractor status with military authorization to operate in crisis zones. Essentially, they would have a license to be heroes. Jake looked at his crew. They had been together for 3 years flying cargo routes and avoiding attention. It was honest work, but not particularly fulfilling. This offer was a chance to do something that mattered. Save lives. Make a difference. Be the people who answered distress calls when no one else could respond in time. It was also dangerous and would likely get them killed eventually. But Jake had never been good at choosing safety over doing what was right. He asked his crew what they thought. Pete said he was tired of fixing refrigeration units and replacing worn cargo modules. If they were going to risk death, might as well be for a good reason. Amy pointed out that they had proven they could handle impossible situations. Maybe it was time to stop pretending they were just ordinary merchants and accept they were actually pretty good at rescue operations. Both of them looked at Jake and said they were in if he was. Jake turned to Norton and accepted the offer. When do they start? The Admiral smiled for the first time. Technically, they had already started. The Frontier 7 rescue was their first official operation, though they had not known it at the time. Norton had been monitoring the situation and was preparing to scramble response teams when Jake's intervention resolved the crisis. The Admiral had watched the entire operation unfold and been impressed by Morrison's tactical creativity. That was when Norton decided to make the offer. The fleet needed more people willing to think like Jake did. Medical teams began evacuating the scientists to the frigate for transport back to core worlds. Lisa supervised the evacuation and made sure everyone received proper care. Several researchers specifically asked to thank Jake before leaving. He spent an hour accepting gratitude and deflecting praise. Chris, the young biologist with the infant daughter, gripped Jake's hand and said he would never forget what Morrison had done. His daughter would grow up hearing stories about the cargo captain who saved her father's life. Jake told him to tell her to stay away from dangerous research stations. Lisa was among the last to leave. She had refused evacuation initially, wanting to stay and help rebuild the facility. Norton convinced her that proper reconstruction would take months and require specialized teams. Her skills would be better used reviewing her research data and preparing comprehensive reports. The knowledge she preserved was too valuable to delay. Lisa reluctantly agreed, but made Norton promise that Frontier 7 would be rebuilt and properly defended. The Admiral gave his word. This facility represented important work. It would be restored. Before boarding the transport, Lisa found Jake one final time. She had written a detailed account of the rescue for official records. Her report praised Morrison's courage, tactical thinking, and unwavering commitment to saving lives at personal risk. She wanted him to know that his actions had restored her faith in humanity. In a galaxy that often felt cold and indifferent, he had proven that people still cared about strangers. She kissed his cheek and thanked him for giving her and her team their lives back. Jake watched the transports depart, feeling strangely emotional. The scientists were going home to families and friends who had thought them dead. 23 people would wake up tomorrow in safe beds because he had decided to answer a distress call. That mattered more than cargo routes or profit margins. He understood now why Rodriguez had violated orders to pull Jake's squad out during the war. Some things were more important than following rules. Saving lives was at the top of that list. Norton gathered Jake, Pete, and Amy in the Montana's Pride for a final briefing before the fleet departed. The Admiral explained how their new role would function. They would maintain their ship in civilian status but receive intelligence briefings about potential trouble spots. If situations developed requiring immediate response, they would be authorized to intervene. The fleet would provide backup when possible, but Jake would have final authority on tactics and methods. Norton emphasized that this arrangement was experimental. If it worked, more teams would be recruited. If it failed, the program would be terminated. The Admiral also warned them about the personal costs. This work would be dangerous. They would face hostile forces, impossible odds, and situations where success was uncertain. People they tried to save might die anyway. Missions could fail despite their best efforts. Norton needed them to understand they were volunteering for a role that would test them in ways they could not anticipate. Jake acknowledged the risks. They had just lived through one impossible rescue. He was willing to try again as many times as necessary. Pete asked about the Montana's Pride. The ship needed extensive repairs before attempting another operation. Norton had already arranged for the vessel to be transported to a military shipyard where it would receive full restoration and tactical upgrades. Better shields, improved weapons, enhanced sensors. The ship would remain a cargo hauler in appearance, but gain capabilities that would help them survive dangerous situations. Repairs would take 6 weeks. In the meantime, Jake and his crew would undergo training with military response teams. Amy wanted to know if they would be responding to all distress calls or only specific situations. Norton explained they would focus on cases where standard military response would arrive too late. Hostage situations, medical emergencies, evacuation operations, anything requiring immediate action and creative thinking. The fleet would screen requests and forward appropriate cases. Jake and his crew would have the final decision on whether to respond. Norton would not order them into situations they believed were unwinnable. The briefing concluded, and Norton prepared to return to his flagship. Before leaving, the Admiral pulled Jake aside for a private word. He said he saw something in Morrison that reminded him of officers. 6 weeks passed faster than Jake expected. The Montana's Pride had been completely rebuilt at the military shipyard orbiting Mars. Engineers had restored the damaged sections and added capabilities that transformed the vessel from a simple cargo hauler into something far more formidable. The hull now featured military-grade shielding that could withstand sustained weapons fire. Enhanced engines provided faster acceleration and improved maneuverability. Advanced sensor arrays gave them detection capabilities rivaling naval scouts. Weapon hardpoints had been installed, though Jake kept the armament minimal. He preferred relying on tactics rather than firepower. Pete walked through the upgraded engine room like a child in a toy store. Everything was new and perfectly calibrated. The reactor had been replaced with a military surplus unit that provided twice the power output. Emergency systems had been tripled. Backup generators could keep the ship running for weeks if main power failed. The engineer ran diagnostic after diagnostic, finding nothing wrong and seeming almost disappointed. He told Jake the ship was better than new. It was beautiful. Jake reminded him not to get too attached because they would probably damage it again during their first real mission. Amy spent her time mastering the new navigation and communication systems. The upgraded computer core processed data 10 times faster than their old equipment. The sensor range had expanded dramatically. She could now detect ships and stations at distances that would have been impossible before. The communication suite included military encryption and priority channels that connected directly to Fleet Command. Amy admitted she felt like a proper naval officer with all this equipment. Jake told her not to let it go to her head. They were still civilians who just happened to have nice toys. Training had been intense but valuable. Jake and his crew spent 4 weeks embedded with military response teams learning proper hostage rescue protocols, combat medicine, and crisis negotiation. The instructors were initially skeptical of civilians participating in tactical training. That skepticism vanished when Jake demonstrated the creative problem-solving that had worked at Frontier 7. By the end of training, several officers were asking Jake for advice on unconventional scenarios. He had earned their respect through competence rather than rank. The story of the Frontier 7 rescue had spread throughout human space exactly as Admiral Norton predicted. Jake found himself recognized in stations and spaceports. People wanted to hear about the cargo captain who forced Krellian raiders to retreat. Reporters requested interviews. Documentary producers offered contracts. Jake declined all of it. He was not interested in fame or publicity. The attention made him uncomfortable. Pete found it hilarious and enjoyed watching Jake squirm every time someone asked for an autograph. Lisa Harper sent regular updates about the research data she had preserved. Her work was generating significant interest in the scientific community. 3 universities had offered funding to continue the extremophile studies. The discoveries would help colonists survive on harsh worlds that were currently considered uninhabitable. Lisa credited Jake with making all of this possible. If the raiders had succeeded, years of research would have been lost. She promised that when Frontier 7 was rebuilt, Jake would receive a permanent invitation to visit. Their first official mission came during the 7th week. Admiral Norton contacted them with the situation developing in the outer reaches. A colony transport had suffered catastrophic engine failure and was stranded in deep space. Life support would fail in 36 hours. The nearest fleet vessel was 4 days away. The Montana's Pride was the only ship within range that could reach the transport in time. Jake accepted the mission without hesitation. This was exactly what they had trained for. The rescue operation went smoothly compared to Frontier 7. They reached the transport with 12 hours to spare. Pete worked with the stranded ship's engineer to jury-rig repairs that stabilized life support. Amy coordinated with fleet vessels to arrange proper recovery. Jake organized the evacuation of non-essential personnel to the Montana's Pride, reducing strain on the failing systems. All 147 colonists survived. The mission was textbook and professional, exactly the kind of success Norton had hoped they could achieve. But Jake knew not every mission would be clean. The second call came 2 weeks later. A mining station had been seized by a criminal syndicate demanding ransom. 12 miners were being held hostage. The criminals had given a 48-hour deadline before they started executing prisoners. This situation had ugly written all over it. Jake studied the intelligence reports and formulated a plan that relied on negotiation rather than force. They managed to talk the criminals down and secure the hostages' release without violence. Another success, but this one felt fragile. They had been lucky the criminals were rational. The third mission went bad. A medical facility in a war zone needed evacuation. Jake and his crew arrived to find the situation far worse than reported. Heavy fighting surrounded the facility. Artillery was falling close enough to shake the building. They managed to extract 40 patients and staff but took damage during the escape. Pete spent 3 days repairing hull breaches and replacing burned-out systems. Jake learned an important lesson. Intel was never perfect. They needed to expect surprises and prepare for worst-case scenarios. Word spread among civilian populations in the border territories. When trouble came, you called for help and hoped the Montana's Pride was close enough to respond. Jake Morrison became a name associated with rescue and safety. Other captains started following his example. Independent traders began equipping their ships for emergency response. A movement was growing organically, humans looking out for humans. Communities refusing to accept that distance and danger meant abandoning people in crisis. Admiral Norton visited them after their 5th successful mission. He brought news that the experimental program was being expanded. 3 more civilian response teams were being recruited and trained. Jake's methods were being studied and taught. The defense fleet was officially recognizing that sometimes the best response came from people willing to ignore standard doctrine. Norton thanked Jake for proving the concept worked. Morrison had changed how the fleet thought about crisis response. Jake asked if this meant more regulations and oversight. Norton laughed and assured him that would not happen. The entire point was having teams that operated outside normal constraints. The fleet would continue providing support and intelligence, but tactical decisions remained with the civilian contractors. Jake was relieved. He had been worried that success would lead to bureaucracy and red tape. Norton understood that would defeat the purpose. Sometimes you needed cowboys who made their own rules. The recognition brought unexpected consequences. Jake received a message from Rodriguez, the transport captain who had rescued him during the war. The old captain had retired years ago and was living quietly on a colony world. He had heard about Jake's rescue operations and wanted to say he was proud. Rodriguez said watching Jake pay forward the gift of rescue made his own risky decision worth it. One act of courage had inspired another, creating a chain that was now saving lives across the galaxy. That was legacy worth having. Jake responded to Rodriguez with genuine gratitude. Without that long-ago rescue, Jake would have died on a worthless rock. Everything that followed, every person he had saved, every mission he completed, existed because Rodriguez had decided rules mattered less than people. Jake was simply following the example that had been set for him. Rodriguez wrote back saying that was how it should work. Each generation teaching the next that some things were worth risking everything for. Humanity needed people who understood that. Pete and Amy talked about the future over dinner one night. They had been flying together for years, and this new role felt right, challenging but meaningful. Amy admitted she had been ready to quit hauling cargo and find something more fulfilling. Now she woke up every day knowing their work mattered. Pete agreed. He could fix engines anywhere, but this crew was doing something that made a difference. They were saving lives and building a reputation that inspired others. That was worth the danger and uncertainty. Jake listened to his crew and felt profound gratitude. They had followed him into impossible situations and trusted his judgment even when logic said to run. They were the best team he could imagine. Whatever challenges came next, they would face them together. That knowledge provided comfort during the long nights between missions when he lay awake thinking about the people they had not been able to save. Success did not erase the failures. It just made them easier to bear. The galaxy was vast and dangerous. Raiders still operated in the shadows. Criminals still took hostages. Accidents still stranded ships in deep space. The defense fleet could not be everywhere at once. But now there were people like Jake Morrison who filled the gaps. Civilians with military training and the willingness to risk everything for strangers. The movement was growing. More crews were being recruited. More ships were being equipped. The network of rapid response was spreading across human space. Jake stood on the bridge of the Montana's Pride watching stars streak by as they traveled to their next mission. Another distress call had come through. The silence that followed Jake's declaration stretched for 3 heartbeats before Thex threw his head back and laughed. The sound echoed through the office and the Krellian warriors joined in, their amusement genuine and unforced. One unarmed human threatening 20 armed raiders was the funniest thing they had heard in months. Jake stood motionless with his arms relaxed at his sides, waiting for the laughter to die down. His expression remained calm and serious, which only seemed to make the Krellians find the situation more hilarious. Thex wiped his eyes and leaned forward across the desk. He asked Jake if the human understood how ridiculous that statement was. What possible threat could one merchant captain pose to a fully armed raider team? Was Jake going to ask them to death? The Krellian's tone was mocking, but Jake could see calculation behind the amusement. Thex was wondering if this was a bluff or if the human had genuinely lost his mind. Jake reached up and tapped his earpiece. Amy's voice had been silent during the confrontation, but now he gave her the signal they had planned. Time to show their cards and hope the Krellians believed what they saw. Pete would be initiating the reactor sequence right now, beginning a process that would take 4 minutes to reach critical mass. 4 minutes to convince Thex that retreat was the only logical option. Amy's voice came through the facility's intercom system, cold and professional. Attention all personnel. The cargo vessel Montana's Pride has initiated emergency reactor overload. Detonation will occur in 4 minutes. Estimated blast radius is 2 kilometers. All personnel should evacuate immediately. Her announcement repeated in both English and Krellian. The warriors in the room stopped laughing and reached for weapons. Thex's expression shifted from amusement to dangerous focus. Jake explained the situation in simple terms. His ship's reactor was currently building toward an uncontrolled explosion. When it reached critical mass, the blast would vaporize the entire outpost and everything within range. That included all 3 Krellian assault ships currently in orbit. Pete had rigged every corridor and access point aboard the Montana's Pride with explosive charges. Any attempt to board the ship and stop the overload would result in immediate detonation. Amy had locked the docking clamps with encryption that would take hours to break. They could not undock the ship in time. The Krellian commander's eyes narrowed as he processed the information. He asked Jake if the human was truly willing to die just to kill a few raiders. This was insane even by human standards. Jake met his gaze without flinching. He was not willing to die. He was betting that Thex was not willing to die either. The raiders had one option. Evacuate immediately and live. Stay and die. Simple choice. The countdown showed 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Thex stood from his desk with deliberate slowness. His hand rested on the energy pistol at his belt. He told Jake that humans were known for bluffing. Their species had a reputation for making threats they could not back up. This felt like a desperate attempt to create chaos. Perhaps the reactor overload was fake. Perhaps the human thought Thex would panic and make mistakes. Jake shrugged. Maybe he was bluffing. There was one way to find out. Wait 3.5 minutes and see what happened. The Krellian commander made a decision. He ordered 2 warriors to board the Montana's Pride and shut down the reactor. If the human was telling the truth about explosives, they would trigger them and everyone would know. If this was a bluff, the warriors would seize the ship and execute the crew. Either way, Thex would have his answer. Jake felt his stomach drop but kept his expression neutral. This was the critical moment. If Pete had done his job correctly, this would work. If not, they were all dead anyway. The warriors moved toward the door. Amy's voice provided updates as they crossed the facility toward the docking port. They entered the airlock, cycled through, stepped onto the Montana's Pride. Jake heard Pete's voice in his earpiece, quiet and tense. He was watching security feeds as the Krellians moved through the ship. 3 seconds until they reached the first trigger point. 2 seconds. 1. The explosion rattled through the facility, transmitted through the docking connection. Not the full reactor detonation, but a shaped charge that Pete had positioned to create maximum noise and damage without actually destroying the ship. Amy reported casualties. Both Krellian warriors were down, injured but alive. The explosion had collapsed a section of corridor and filled that part of the ship with fire suppression foam. The reactor overload continued unchanged. 2 minutes and 55 seconds until detonation. Jake turned to Thex and explained what had just happened. His crew had been telling the truth. The ship was rigged. The reactor was building toward critical mass. Every second the Krellian stayed was a second closer to death. Thex's expression shifted from anger to grudging respect. The human had been serious. This was not a bluff. His hand tightened on his pistol, and for a moment Jake thought the commander would simply shoot him out of spite. Then the Krellian's tactical training overrode his pride. He had 3 ships and 20 warriors. Losing all of them for the sake of pride was unacceptable. He triggered his communicator and ordered a full evacuation. All personnel to return to their vessels immediately. Prepare for emergency departure. The facility erupted into controlled chaos. Krellian warriors abandoned their positions and moved toward the airlocks where their boarding craft waited. Jake stood perfectly still as armed raiders rushed past him. Some looked at him with hatred, others with something that might have been respect. One human had just forced an entire raider team into retreat through sheer audacity. It was the kind of story that would spread through the underworld. The countdown showed 2 minutes and 20 seconds. Thex did not move. He stood watching Jake with those cold yellow eyes. The Krellian commander said something in his own language that the translator did not catch. Then he switched to English. He told Jake that this was clever, forcing evacuation without firing a shot, using the raiders' own survival instincts against them. But Thex had not survived 40 years of combat by accepting defeat. If he was leaving, he would make sure the humans learned a painful lesson about humiliating Krellian warriors. The commander moved to the wall panel and entered a series of commands. Jake felt his blood turn to ice as he realized what was happening. Thex was locking down the facility's life support systems, sealing doors, disabling emergency overrides. He was turning Frontier 7 into a tomb. The Krellians would evacuate, but the human prisoners and Jake's crew would be trapped inside when the Montana's Pride exploded. Everyone would die together. Thex smiled at Jake's expression. The human had won the battle but lost the war. Jake's mind raced through options. He could try to stop Thex physically, but the Krellian was stronger, faster, and armed. He would die before entering the first command. He could ask Amy to override the lockdown from the ship, but she would need time they did not have. The countdown showed 1 minute and 48 seconds. In less than 2 minutes, the reactor would detonate. Even if they stopped Thex now, there was no time to evacuate everyone through the limited escape routes. Pete's voice crackled in Jake's earpiece. The engineer was asking for instructions. Should he abort the reactor sequence? They had proven their point. Thex was evacuating. But Jake knew that aborting now would tell the Krellian commander the whole thing had been a bluff. Thex would call his warriors back. The rescue would fail and everyone would die anyway. They were committed. All or nothing. The reactor had to detonate or this entire gamble was worthless. Thex finished entering his commands and stepped back from the panel. The facility's lights shifted from white to red emergency lighting. Blast doors slammed shut throughout the complex, sealing sections off from each other. The prisoners in the cafeteria would be trapped. Lisa in her hiding place would be unable to escape. Jake and his crew would die with the people they had tried to save. The Krellian commander headed toward the door, his posture relaxed and satisfied. He had ensured that even in retreat he achieved his objective. No witnesses, no survivors. Jake watched him go and felt everything collapsing around him. He had been so focused on forcing the evacuation that he had not anticipated this response. Tex had outmaneuvered him at the last second. The countdown showed 1 minute and 18 seconds. Not enough time to override the lockdowns. Not enough time to evacuate. Not enough time for anything except dying together. He had failed. He had led his crew to their deaths and doomed the people they had tried to rescue. Then Amy's voice filled his earpiece, urgent and excited. She had been watching the security feeds. Lisa Harper was on the move. The commander had left her hiding place and was heading toward the central dome. Amy did not know what Lisa was planning, but the woman was accessing maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the facility. Tunnels that the lockdown had not sealed because they were part of the environmental system. Jake felt hope flare in his chest. Lisa knew this facility. She had been living here for months. If anyone could find a way out of this trap, it would be her. Jake ran toward the cafeteria where the prisoners were being held. The countdown showed 53 seconds. He could hear Krellian ships undocking and boosting away from the station.